first of all, to everybody, welcome globally. I'm looking at participants and I see that there's people from everywhere. A few Canadians in the mix, which is absolutely beautiful to see. Welcome to our INSHPO webinar series 2024. This is the second of three planned webinars for 2024. In June 26th this year, we hosted Susan Romero from EPSAL and connecting health and safety and well-being in the digital age. If you want to take a look at that recording, you can find that on our website under the events tab. Scroll down to the bottom and you'll see that there for you. And on the 2nd of December, our own intern, Brenton Harrison, will be speaking on coaching versus mentoring. And that's December the 2nd. I'm not sure if registration's open at the moment, but the website has all of that information for you under the events. So today your mics are disabled because it's a webinar. And we are going to use the Q&A function just to make sure that we capture all of the questions and answers, and we'll address most of those at the end. But of course, if Karen's up to multitasking and can look at those questions in the Q&A and there's something timely, she certainly has been she will be able to answer those questions at the time. Today I have a true honor, as well as the distinct pleasure to introduce you to someone whom I met in Edinburgh a few years ago, and I've grown to admire over the years. Karen Hewitt is the director of Leader Like Limited and has spent the last 12 years, that's over a decade, and it's a dozen, creating leadership movements for health and safety, both within large organizations and outside of them. Combining transformational leadership with change communications, she breathes new life into traditional health, safety, and well-being thinking, and believes that transformational health and safety starts with leading and communicating in a way that breaks with the status quo. Her second book, People Power: Transform Your Business in the Era of Safety and Well-Being, published in 2021, has won several awards and been an Amazon #1 bestseller multiple times. Most recently, she demonstrates what communicating differently on health and safety looks like in her 2023 TEDx talk entitled "The 2 Questions That Could Save Your Life." Today, Karen's here to talk to us about communicating your way from compliance to care. With the global shift in focus from health and safety to well-being, organizations worldwide are looking to make their own shift from compliance to care. Both are essential, but making care a priority makes your compliance more likely to happen in a virtuous circle that benefits all parts of the organization. But with a culture of care seemingly so intangible and elusive, where do we start? One option is through effective communication. It's no substitute for the structural changes required, but may well be the lever that creates the space and ownership that employees and their organizations need to change, allowing them to take a deeper dive into and a more systemic approach to what us human beings really need to thrive at work. Join Karen Hewitt of Leader Like Limited for some of these practical ideas and inspiration on the vital role of communication in a culture of care, and how viewing care through this lens could unlock potential you hadn't previously considered. Without further ado, Karen, it's yours.
Fantastic. Can everybody hear me okay? Give me a nod, Crystal. You can hear me okay?
I can hear you just wonderfully, yes.
Fantastic. So I'm hoping everyone else can as well and see me as well. Great. I can see some thumbs up there. So that was I think a really comprehensive introduction to why this topic is coming up today and why I wanted to talk about it. And essentially, we're going to look at this huge subject of culture of care So, no doubt about it, it is a huge subject. It's not easy, otherwise, we'd have all nailed it by now. But sometimes when you look at things through a slightly different lens, it can give you a bit more clarity and it can give you a bit more traction. And that's what I'm hoping to do today. I'm hoping to take you on a bit of a journey, 45 minutes with some questions at the end. Although, as Crystal said, feel free to ask questions as you go. And if my multitasking is on point, I will be, and it seems appropriate, I shall be straight in and answering those questions. Okay. So, this idea of a culture of care, we all know we need a culture of compliance. And I think when I first personally started hearing about culture of care, those specific words was around the COVID time when really it became, we started to realize the impact of not caring about our people. And that was a global phenomenon that brought all of us together. The spotlight went on well-being, and people wider than health and safety were talking about a culture of care. Now, you could argue that in health and safety, we've been talking about it for a while, at least I think I was, if we go back those 12 years, but maybe talking about it with a different name. We were talking about a strong safety culture, and that was around caring for people. But I've really noticed this term culture of care come to the fore. And my background before those 12 years in health and safety was in communication and leadership. So this is why I really like to add to the technical skills that you all have and bring my communication lens to see if we can shine a light on the path going forward. So, to shine a light on the path going forward, sometimes we do need a slightly different lens. So, we're going to slice things up a bit differently today and look through the lens of communication. And as you can see from the picture, sometimes it brings some things into view that we hadn't previously seen. So, I'm hoping by the end of this webinar today, you're going to see some things that you hadn't seen before, or maybe they were things you knew about, obvious things, but I've just shone a light on them because, we don't have to have bright, shiny new things all the time. There are things that are there all around us, and we just need a penny to drop sometimes to get after them. So this is the agenda for the next 45 minutes, and we're going to break it down because I believe on a journey, you can't just give everyone all the information or tell them what they need to do. You need to take people with you. So we're going to look to start with, what is a culture of care? Are we talking about the same thing here? Because we can assume we all know what it means, but do we? Why do we need it? I think we could argue that is obvious, but it's good to look at some of the statistics and look at that from different angles. Why is it so important to us and to business? Where does communication come in? Why does communication seem so hard? And I'm going to say that because often, if we're in a technical role, anyone that's in health and safety and engineering, any sort of IT, any kind of technical role, there's a lot of focus on technical skills to get you to the position where you are. And you're not always given so much support on the communication skills. And also, communication in an organization is very multifaceted. So it can seem hard, but today what we're going to do is make it a whole lot easier. And because I really appreciate that you've taken the time to show up today when probably, September is going back to work, going back to school time. Probably you're all really busy, but it's really important to make sure your time counts. So what can we do, practically speaking, to get the movement started? So I'd love to hear at the end that you've, as well as your questions, that you've taken something away from today. So what is a culture of care? Well, I did go digging, looking for various definitions, and the idea of a culture of care has been looked at in other settings like healthcare and schools. So anywhere where we're caring for people. And one of the most interesting definitions I found was from somebody called Dr. Tom Kavanagh. And he's looked at a culture of care, he's researched it in the school setting and transposed it into workplaces. And there are some key elements highlighted here that I want to draw your attention to. It's about the importance of relationships, saying the relationships are more important than the work, particularly when defining the purpose of the organization. So it has to run really deep. It's not just about caring for people on the outskirts of what's happening in the everyday conversations. It's about making it part of our core. And also, really interestingly, because I absolutely love this word, potential is probably one of my favorite words in the whole universe, because I believe all of us have so much potential, and sometimes things are getting in the way. So how can we make sure that people reach their potential? So it's interesting here because we tend to think of a culture of care about keeping people safe, well, preventing them coming to harm, avoiding incidents. But if we flip that, it's also about setting people up for success, helping them to thrive. So it's almost like the accelerator and the brake in a car, accelerator, how do we keep accidents at bay, incidents at bay, and the brake, sorry, other way round, brake, how can we keep the accidents at bay, and accelerator, I'm already accelerating clearly, is how do we set people up for success and help them to thrive. And when we do that, if we look at the definition of culture of care in those two aspects, so really the prevention side and the proactive thriving side, we can see that we've got more than health and safety and well-being in the mix here. It's not just about us. And I'm sure if you're I'm sure you're already working with other parties in the organization, but this really brings to the fore how much we can't do it alone. Not only because we can't do it alone, but also the more joined up we are with other parts of the organization, the more consistent the message. And the more consistent the message, the more it's repeated, the more people can grasp it, the more people can act on it. So we need to be joined up with HR, also initiatives in diversity, equity, and inclusion, because what we're really looking at here is we're looking at keeping people safe and well, keeping people included, because that is caring for people. When people feel psychologically safe and included, then they're going to thrive. And also, what development do we need to give them to set them up for success? So again, we're looking at the brake and the accelerator and looking at what parts of the organization are involved. So when we look at culture of care through the communication lens, it's not just about communicating out to the employees, it's about communicating to the other stakeholders that we need to be joined up with. In fact, that is probably the first step. And also looking at how deep is the care. So really, this apple is a bit like an organization. And you know how it feels if you encounter an organization that's got a lot of bright, shiny messages about being a culture of care. But when you actually scratch beneath the surface, take a bite out of the apple, you find that the underneath isn't quite as solid. And so if we're communicating, we need to also recognize what people need, what's behind the communication, and how we communicate back, how deep the care is, what are we actually doing to care for people, and recognizing that we're all human. So ideally, we want to have a one size fits all from an organizational perspective and resources. The more we can have a blanket approach, in a way, it's easier to bring people together. We've got common understanding, common messages, common agreement, and it's easier to scale up your culture of care because we're not having all these different approaches. However, we are all human. And if you think about yourself as an individual, at any sort of point in the day, there are times where we might feel carefree. Anyone feel carefree right now? We sort of associate that a bit with childhood, maybe not with work, but there are moments when you feel carefree. Maybe we'll embrace that moment right now. There are times when we feel a bit careless. Maybe we're overloaded, stressed, frustrated, tired. And there's times when we feel really careful. And careful is a word that is really important for health and safety and a culture of care. We want to know that other people are taking care, they are full of care. But what we need to remember is there are beliefs behind this. Because if somebody thinks that something, an incident, a problem will never happen to them, then they're not going to be very careful. So think about the beliefs that are behind this, and we need to be able to communicate to address that belief that, yes, it could happen to me, it could happen to you, it could happen to the rest of the organization, but it won't if all of us are careful. So embracing our carefree and our careless sometimes, but recognizing that there are times when we really need to be careful. So this idea of care, we might typically, when I talked about the apple and just biting through the surface, you know, if it's just at surface level, it might be as simple as me saying, "Hi everyone, how are you today?" And you might sort of say, "Yeah, okay, feeling good, Karen." So we've got that everyday conversation around care. And it's a really good first step to get people talking and asking each other how they are. But to get a culture of care, that is really about all of us doing the same thing, acting as a collective. So we're all every day asking each other how we are. But we're doing it in a sustainable way. So it needs to be built into the way we do things around here. And I can see some love emojis coming through. So I sense the care is already going across the webinar here, going across the globe, because we have people from all over the globe. Absolutely loving it. And then behind that, we also have an infrastructure of care. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is it's no good having the everyday care. It's no good having the culture of care where we're all showing care for each other every day and it's built into the way we do things if we don't have the infrastructure that allows us to feel cared for. And I'm talking about going further up the hierarchy of controls here, things like work design, work job demands. You know, we can have somebody say, you know, how are you every day and listen to us. But if we're overworked, overloaded, we're set up to fail, then it's really not going to fly. So it's kind of a three-step process that we need to be communicating at all of these levels. So why do we need it? So some statistics to start with. Just going to care for my voice 1 second. So from the Future Forum Pulse, 10,000 responses here at a global level. This is from 2022. You can see the top line indicator here for people feeling burned out at work in 2022 was 42%. Very interesting to see, because I know we've got people from all over the world, how that bears out across the globe, and potentially slightly lower in Japan, which is interesting. But people are experiencing burnout. It's real. And we could argue that people need to take their own measures to not feel burnt out. And of course, that is entirely possible. But if we really have a culture of care, how are we setting people up to avoid burnout? How are we setting people up to work in an environment where burnout just doesn't happen? And if we look at, so taking some figures from the US here, we got 70 from a different survey, 77% of workers reporting experiencing stress recently. And then if we flip that to look at what people need, what they're asking for. So again, back to this idea of the break, avoiding the burnout, the accelerator, how are we setting people up for success? A massive 95% said it was important to them to feel respected at work. So I think care is associated with this idea of respect. So looking through the lens of communication, it's about being listened to, their views being respected. So it's not just what we communicate on a culture of care, but what we hear and what we do with it. Then in the UK, just recently, we have reported, because I'm in the UK, living in the UK, 2.83 million people not working due to long-term sickness. And that was peaked at an all-time high in April. And this is what John Boyce said we need to do: prioritise occupational health services. We need to take steps to address the impact of stress. So again, he's talking about that break there, the prevention. How do we avoid getting to this situation? And then I just want to flip back to the accelerator, setting people up to thrive, because a few years back, Gallup did some really interesting research about high performance and discovered that when people are operating to their strengths, when they know their strengths, there's a focus on their strengths, they feel good, they perform well. And these are all the performance increases you can see. Interesting one at the bottom, 22 to 59% fewer safety incidents. So I think if we start to extrapolate, when we set people up for success, of course, they're going to be more engaged, happier, safer, more productive, going to bring in more business, and the reputation is going to go through the roof, which is going to bring in more business. There's going to be more innovation, adaptability to the market, sustainability. So you can't really go wrong when you bet on your people. And I know you all know this. I know I'm already saying what you already know, but these are some interesting arguments that you might want to share wider in your organization. So I said I was taking you on a bit of a journey, and this is where we come to the subject of communication, because going back to what I said earlier, we tend to think that communication is about from us out to the workforce, from top management out to the workforce, blanket communication. This is what we're doing on well-being. This is what you can access. This is our policy on a culture of care. This is our mental health policy. Sort of a bit of a broadcast, I guess, a bit like I'm doing now. But actually, there are opportunities, and I'm going to call them opportunities because sometimes it feels like a bit of a maze, and we'll go there in a minute. But actually, this maze has opportunities because there are opportunities on all levels to communicate and make a success of a culture of care. We've got opportunities in the process. And if we put a hierarchy of controls approach to a culture of care, we've got the opportunities at the sort of individual level to protect people, maybe addressing the symptoms, mental health first aiders, maybe, offering people yoga classes, things at the symptom level. But if we really want to prevent, manage out, set people up for success, we need to go further up the hierarchy of controls. And every time we do that, we've got an opportunity to communicate on it, to talk about our policies, not just about being what we do at this level, but it's about our whole strategy and structure and our whole work design. Our work design is based on a culture of care, and this is what we've done. Can you imagine the strength of that? And this is where it is difficult because change is hard for us at individual level. Change is hard at an organizational level. So there needs to be a lot of belief that betting on your people is going to bring all the benefits I talked about. It's a massive leap of faith. We need to recognize that. But it is a no-brainer. It will bring all those benefits. So if we really do start to make some small tweaks higher up the hierarchy of controls and communicate on that, we can start to get some traction. And then we've got touch points. I call them touch points because they're opportunities to communicate on a culture of care. And you might recognize these 6. In the UK, we call them the UK's Health and Safety Executive Stress Management Standards. And that was what John Boyce was talking about in the quote earlier. So these are opportunities to communicate on a culture of care and to adjust a culture of care. We can adjust job demands, the amount of control people have got over their work, the amount of support they receive, the relationships, via our zero tolerance policies, clarity of roles, and how we manage change. Change is happening all the time. So how we manage that is a fantastic opportunity to communicate in a way that shows care. So we're sort of dividing up this problem now from a few different angles. It's like a giant Rubik's Cube. We're turning it different ways and seeing a slightly different picture. And then we've got the touch points in time. So we're sort of already onto a 3D model here, like the Rubik's Cube. Because it's no good just having a culture of care at one point in time. We need to weave this into all of our policies and our strategies and our job design when we attract people, when we recruit them, when we onboard them, and then we'll go, this is why I was talking about linking up with HR and other people that are working on these initiatives. So you can embed your messages around a culture of care into theirs so that they are seamless. When you retain people and when you transfer people, whether they're going somewhere else in the organization or out of the organization, to potentially talk about your organization. And the smallest of examples make a huge difference. So we would call that employee experience. So another key stakeholder would be the person that runs your employee experience in your organization. So now more than ever, if we want to shift from compliance to care, the health and safety professionals can be at the forefront of this. We know how to prevent risks. We know how to set people up for success. We have the risk-based approach. We have a massive opportunity, if we understand where the touch points are and the stakeholders, to reach out and start communicating externally within our organizations. So we set our employees up for success and ourselves in the process. So I talked about a Rubik's Cube before, or really we could look at it as a room full of lasers where communication is omnipresent. We have an opportunity to look at all these, where all these lasers are, all these possibilities. And it may seem complicated, but the more we start to identify them, the more we can share one joined up message and have the power in the collective message. Remembering, of course, that it can be easy to undermine, because as soon as we focus on the numbers rather than the people, that's what people start to believe. Nobody cares about the people, they care about the numbers. And when we start to transition from compliance to care, potentially, we want to measure what we're doing, which is good to measure, but we need to remember to even do a 50-50, make sure we're talking about the people as much as we're talking about the tasks and the numbers. And we will undermine our efforts when we don't make the changes that people really need. So if we go out to the workforce and say, what do you need to be set up to feel cared for and be successful? And then we don't make those changes, but we give people what we think they need, then people aren't going to feel respected or listened to. And there's another danger here. When we go out and ask the workforce and the stakeholders, and we ask them what they need, and because we don't set up the psychological safety, people will either not speak at all, they won't tell us what they need, or because they're fearing for their career prospects, breaking the relationship, they might tell us what we want to hear. So another case scenario where we're ready to make the changes people need, but we haven't got the information we want because people aren't telling us. So communication, this wonderful world, is full of illusions, and the single biggest illusion is that it has actually taken place. But fingers crossed, you are all with me, and this communication is taking place right now. So why does it seem so hard? And I always think if you start out by looking at the barriers, what could get in the way, then you're really well positioned to deal with it. It's a bit like a comedian that plans the heckles they're going to get, and then they can proactively prepare a response to each and every one of those heckles. And when they actually respond to them, to the audience, it looks completely spontaneous. So effectively, they've managed out the issues. And this is what we can do with communication. So in the same way as we manage out incidents, we are experts at it, we can manage out the communication challenges as well. So one challenge we have is imposing change on people. We just tell people what we're going to do. Okay, we're going to have a culture of care. This is what we're going to do. And you know how that feels when somebody says that to you. This is how it feels, because when we ask for change, people are already doing something else. They've got their existing habits. I think, hang on, but I'm doing it this way right now. And now you're asking me to do it that way. So there's a certain amount of emotion around having to let go of what you're already doing and start doing something differently. So you need to acknowledge that, give people a bit of space to consider what the other options are. So it's about just creating a bit of space. So if you're suggesting a new idea, creating that bit of space for people to sort of come to terms with it, let go of the old, embrace the possibilities, and maybe even get a bit of ownership around the new beginnings and moving forward. And even if we manage to achieve that, in an organization these days, I don't know how big your organizations are, the communication can look a bit like this. Now, this was, don't worry, there are no spiders in here as far as I can see. This is a huge sort of old spider's web. You would imagine the size of it. There was quite a big spider there, but it reminds me a bit of all the communication clutter we have in organizations, because if people are just communicating on a superficial level, we've got an initiative here, an initiative there, then it's like these bursts of communication. Sometimes you get different parts of the organization not joined up, duplicating, communicating the same thing in different ways. And the employees end up thinking, well, I really don't know what's going on here, so I'm going to do nothing. And physically, our brains can't take the overload, because there was a book called Flow published in 2002 by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, a Hungarian biologist. And he said back 20 years ago, our human brains were only processing a fraction of the information we're receiving every second. From millions of bits of information every second, we were only processing 126 bits. And that was 20 years ago. And really, our information overload has grown exponentially. So unless we simplify our communication on culture of care, unless we link up with the other parts of the organization, we have no hope of our message getting through. Because what people are doing is people are invoking selective attention bias. They're focusing on their jobs, what they need to do. And this is represented by the gorilla here. If you've seen any of the research by Simons and Shabris, showing that you can watch two teams playing basketball and focus on counting which team had the most passes. Most people will never see the gorilla that walks through the middle, the person in the gorilla suit, because we have our heads down focusing. It's a bit like I'm doing right now. I'm really focusing on delivering my best ever webinar. So Crystal said, let's, see if Karen can multitask with the questions in the chat. I see no questions right now, but actually there's a danger. My selective attention bias is in, and I've got somebody talking to me, around culture of care, other things, and I'm just not seeing it, because quite rightly, I'm focused on the job in hand. So we really need to make a culture of care part of the job in hand. Otherwise, people are going to be focused on that and not seeing things on the periphery. Another argument for being integrated in our messaging. And then, of course, forgetting is easy. Of course it is. You've probably already forgotten what I talked about right at the beginning, which is why I'm using images and talking about accelerators, brakes, and Rubik's cubes and gorillas, because these are the things that are going to stick in your mind. And Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve, his research on memory recall done 100 years ago, is still very true today. That if we don't repeat things up to 4 or 5 times, they're just lost. And the brain will sort by recency. So if you're not using things every day, you're going to forget it. So if I'm hesitating over some facts and figures today, it will be because I haven't used it yesterday. So my brain is trying to dig deep and find these facts and figures. So you're thinking about culture of care. If those messages aren't integrated and they aren't part of the everyday, or if you're not repeating them regularly, then people are going to forget them. And then, especially for the animal lovers, we are creatures of habit. There's another thing called status quo bias. So we have a tendency to stay on the same wheel. And sometimes we get so caught up on the same wheel that we forget to even ask ourselves, is this the right wheel we want to be on? So we don't often take a step back to have a look. So you imagine trying to communicate with people, ask them, okay, communication, culture of care, we need to do these new habits now. We all need to do this every day. We need to do this differently. To get people to get off the wheel, it's going to take a bit of attention, but there is hope, because if you're looking really carefully, you will notice there's a third hamster just behind there having a little sniff at that wheel. So the hamster is able to get off the wheel and have a look. And potentially, because you've turned up today, this is exactly what we're doing. We're taking 45 to 60 minutes to get off our wheels and ask ourselves, is there a better wheel we need to be on? So we need to give people that time, that space to get off the wheels if we want a culture of care. Because in organizations, this is one of my beautiful photos from Paphos, Cyprus, in case anyone's ever been there. But change tends to look like this: one rock piled on one rock, piled on one rock, with us feeling a bit overwhelmed underneath. It's almost like there's no space for change. Whereas if we start to link up with other parts of the organization, we dovetail into what's already happening, what they're doing with our messaging. And we create space for consultation, for people to think about things. Not only are we tapping into the way they, but we're creating a bit of space for people to reflect and think, is there a better way? What do I need to do differently? So our culture of care needs to have some concrete pebbles there, some action steps, but we also need that space in between for some conversation, some adaptation. Are we doing the right thing? What do we need to change in our work design? Is it working? So I promised you some concrete steps, and I think we've already hinted at some of them. So I'm just going to have a quick look. Yeah, I can see some messages coming in. Yeah, so I'm going to keep going. So getting the movement started. So Crystal, when she introduced me, talked about my experience in getting leadership movement started. So it can be the hardest thing to get things started, and even harder to keep it going. But sometimes the small things and the simple things really work, in my experience, which is why everything I've been talking about today is about coming up with one single message, repeat it, get everyone to buy into it, get everyone repeating the same thing. And I know that people will say to you, but we do it different around here in this part of the business. But if you say, okay, I know you do it different, but what are the things we do the same? Keep bringing people back to the things we do the same, the common actions we can do as human beings. What are the common factors in what human beings need? And first of all, we all need a North Star. This is me on a bridge near my home. We don't just need goals and objectives, because these are quite task based. We need something bigger that we can keep moving towards, because in any one day, we are all facing obstacles. Nothing stays the same. 1 minute, as I said, we're carefree, careful, careless. We're changeable. We're human beings. But to be resilient, we need to have a North Star to move towards. So the first step for me in creating a culture of care, and communication has a big role to play here, is stating what we want to be. Here's an example. We want to be the most people-focused company in our industry. Something that people can relate to, because not everybody understands the same thing by a culture of care. But what ambition can you state? And often we don't say it big enough. And then we need to know who else is involved in that ambition. So we need to get right out of our silos, even if everyone else is operating in silos. We as health and safety professionals need to be the ones that go out and understand the big picture, the whole honeycomb. You know, we know that we're worker bees, we get things done, but we need to be the ones going out, looking out in the other parts of the honeycomb and bringing people in to us, going out, listening to them and bringing people in. Because if we can get our organizational honeycomb joined up, we can get some single messages that we can all buy into. It may take a few months of work on the consultation part to do this, but I would easily spend 6 months just talking and understanding before I formulated my messages, and knowing that the once I launched them, they were going to stick because I've already done all that pre-engagement. And then we start thinking about what is the message that's going to create the domino effect. Because if you've ever played with dominoes at home, you'll know that, and those with an engineering background, you'll know it takes two things to make it work. You need alignment and momentum. So you can start things off, and we're often good at starting things off in organizations, but the more we can have a simple, repeatable message, the easier it is for people to pass it on, for it to be repeated, for it to gain momentum. So that's the alignment I'm talking about. It's about the alignment of messaging. And enrolling everyone in that messaging. And often what people want to know is, what is the big picture and what's my role in it? What are you really asking me to do? So here's an example of a joined up pitch that for change for a culture of care. I want to be the most people-focused company in our industry. And to do it, I can't do it by myself. I'm going to need leadership from every single one of you, because we've all got a stake in this culture of care and we all stand to benefit. So whether you feel like an expert or not, I want us all to show leadership where we can. It's going to mean no compromise on the people stuff ever, at any time, anywhere we do business, and a belief, because behavior follows belief, that 100% people focus is possible and is going to bring us all the benefits we deserve. And realizing this might take you out of your comfort zone, we are going to raise your standard level of awareness. Not everybody is comfortable with the idea of being a culture of care leader. So we'll give you some standard levels of awareness so that you have a degree of comfort and are able to communicate to others that putting people first matters, and that anyone can challenge anyone if they feel a people risk exists. So imagine the culture of care we could build together if we all got on board. So example pitch, and if that resonated a little bit and I was slightly ad-libbing, and if you think, well, yeah, that would pretty much win me over, people could be won over, but they're thinking, well, hang on, there's some things I need to get involved. And according to Daniel Pink's theory of motivation, people need purpose, mastery, and autonomy. You've effectively created a sense of purpose with that big pitch there, and with the North Star, the ambition. So how about creating a bit of a development path for people around a culture of care? Give them some skills and a development path so that they feel like every day they're getting better and better, because it's human nature to want to learn, to want to get better. So that's your mastery. And then autonomy, allow people to engage in different ways. So allow them to show their leadership in different ways. There's not just one style of leadership. We all have different personality preferences. So the more you can do at one level, you've got a one size fits all on the communication message, but you're also allowing for some individual differences here. And ask better questions, because it's great for me to say to you today, are you okay? But an even better question that allows us to take a bigger bite of that apple and really get to the core of what we need to change is, what do you need to be okay? And that's probably got your mind thinking. Because an open question can change the outcome, because our closed questions often confirm known problems, verify existing knowledge. We probably already made an assumption whether someone's okay or not. And it can make someone feel a bit tested. Why are they asking me if I'm okay? Is there something I'm doing that, suggests I'm not okay? But an open question might discover a completely unknown problem that nobody knew existed. So we're talking innovation here, new insights, and it creates energy. Because when I ask you that question, what do you need to be okay? That created some energy in your brain. It created energy in me, because I can't see what you're thinking, but I was thinking, I wonder what they were thinking of right now. And I'm going to finish with this quote, because we were talking about a culture of care. And the fact is, nobody really cares how much you know about a culture of care until they know how much you care. And communication is the opportunity to show people, but not just any old communication, because I'm going to use the metaphor of a net or a bridge with lots of holes in it. So we need it to be one single bridge. It needs to span wide. It needs to be deep. We need to have a sense of direction, and everyone needs to be on the same path. So that's what I'm going to leave you with now. And I'm going to open the floor to questions.
Well, there aren't any questions in the Q&A, and the chat seems to be a lot of comments. Karen, wow. Wow. I took some notes, and as you could probably expect, I have some. First of all, thank you. Thank you for putting it all together. You know, just walking through the steps. And I wrote down some cool things about the 5 steps, or six. I actually have 6 notes, so there's more than 5. Karen, when you started out, you talked about culture of care. So saying that we knew we needed compliance, but and we've known that caring's important, but we didn't necessarily term it care. You talked about care with the analogy of a car, and you talked about braking and accelerating. My question at that point, Karen, who's driving the car?
Fantastic question. Yeah. Who's driving the car? I think we're all driving the car. I think it's a shared responsibility. This is a really interesting question when it comes to culture of care, because I'm going to use the example. My daughter started school this week, and she needs to have snacks in her bag for school. And we were told not to put any nuts in the bag because it's a nut-free school. So here is the answer to who is driving the car. We all are, because the school has taken the responsibility to do all they can to prevent an incident with nuts by establishing the nut-free policy and communicating that. But they're also asking the parents to take their share of the responsibility to make sure that they are not putting nuts in the bag. And I think if we all take our responsibility, everyone in the organization, it becomes easier and it becomes more rewarding. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Yeah, you and I can dive a little bit deeper, because then I'm going to throw you the monkey wrench and say, well, you know what? We've got a number of blind individuals that I'm not comfortable driving the bus. So that's I get I get it, and I appreciate that it is a shared responsibility. Anton has a question, and Anton said it's been great listening to Karen with this structure. How can we approach change in practical steps to embrace care and to also maintain the momentum with creating such an environment?
Yeah, so there are a lot of interesting models around change. Within organization, John Cotter has a great 8-step model. And I'm going to caveat that and say that what I've discovered in my 12 years is you can often follow a change process, and you can go step by step. It starts with a vision. It starts defining all your stakeholders, bringing them together, defining your message. But that often takes about 6 months. And what happens in the meantime is you've sort of made those decisions based on a point in time. And sometimes the whole organization can change in 6 months, which is a bit of a wow moment. You think, I'm trying to change something, but at the same time, everything around me is moving. So what I try to do when I build in the change I'm looking for is two things. One is quick wins. So identifying the planning, where can you get some quick wins? So get in fast with some areas of the business that are ready to embrace and start seeing the early successes with a small closed group, publicize the successes. And sometimes it then becomes a bit of a Trojan mouse rather than a Trojan horse. So, your Trojan horse is the big plan. We're going to go in and do this wholesale change. But sometimes the smaller things, the smaller simple things can get traction quicker because in all the information overload, people can grasp it. They can do something realistically. And then, so you start small, have the big plan, but start small. And yeah, so recognize the successes, the quick wins, and also see if you can embed some really simple stuff. For example, when I was working in a large organization, we introduced 7 habits for people to adopt based around the kinds of incidents we were having. So very relevant to everyone in the organization. Did a lot of pre-engagement, communicated them what they meant for people. And even when everything started to change, the habits stuck because they stood the test of time, they were relevant. Because the more you make something generic, the more relevant it is, regardless of the change. When things are changing, say, okay, so now we have to manage well-being as well, but these great habits will adapt to well-being. Now we've got resilience. Well, how would this apply to resilience? So if you can find something that is more standing the test of time, so the simple stuff, the more generic stuff works.
That's what you'd said, or finding the common, what's common,
Yeah.
finding that commonness. Thank you for that. One of the questions we got here is, how does one, as an EHS professional, influence the culture of care when the organization top leadership does not embrace such and can be seen as more focused as a culture of productivity at all cost? So revenue over care.
Yeah, so you've got a few challenges there. One is getting their attention and getting them to listen to you, getting in the door. And the second one is building your argument. And people are convinced in different ways. Sometimes we have what is called a 3 times convincer, most of us. Sometimes we hear some advice and we're not initially convinced. I just had a wisdom tooth taken out and it took 3 different dentists to convince me it was the right thing to do. So sometimes you need 3 ways to speak to people, 3 opportunities to speak to people. Be prepared to keep banging the same drum, but also be prepared to build your argument around the value that it will bring to the business. If you can start, quantifying the break side, what are the losses you're going to avoid, and also quantify what could be achieved if people start to thrive. And often you can look in the places that are hardest to reach. For example, if you start, it all goes back to reaching out and making friends with your stakeholders, because stakeholders, for example, like HR, hold the absenteeism data, or if they don't hold it, you can convince them to start holding that. And often when people are looking at focus on productivity and cutting costs, they're looking for the obvious stuff. Where's the quick wins, the low-hanging fruit? But there are some less obvious stuff like absenteeism that are costing companies a lot of money, that if you show you can make a dent in that, that is a real benefit for a culture of care. So I think sometimes starting to look in the less obvious places and building up your cases and be prepared to keep at it to convince people. And if you can't even get in the door, start just convincing those that will listen as high as you can get. If you can't get into the board, who's one down from the board or one down? If you can convince one person, they'll convince another. And people operating at a senior level love new data and new insights. So this is your opportunity to link up with your stakeholders, get some new interesting data that's going to make them really sit up.
You bring up, look at different revenue streams, and I'm just gonna throw in there, one of the things that I did with an organization I worked with was I talked about how much money it costs to hire and train somebody versus how much it costs to invest in somebody that's already there. So that's another
Yeah.
thing that you can look at, is those costs are really high. I've got another question here, and we're getting pretty close to the end. As we all know, safety is each and everyone's responsibilities while at work. What is the best way to communicate apart from visual awareness? I think what we're trying to get at is amongst peers more so than up or down.
Yeah, so my go-to mechanisms are storytelling and metaphors. So you will, because sometimes people can't always see the obvious. You have to visualize the consequences and visualize the idea that it could happen to you or it could happen to someone. So you have to help people to get that penny to drop, as we say in English. And sometimes the metaphors, everywhere I've talked about bridges, cars, gorillas, I've been using metaphors which will allow you to remember a certain idea and also a story. For example, if I told you about the Netflix documentary on White Island, New Zealand, where a lot of people sadly died from potentially a known risk. In the documentary, the final person on screen says, and she was the tour guide, said, I knew the risk was there, but I thought it would never happen to me. So I think, and that was a snippet of a story, but you can see it's a whole lot more engaging. So I do a lot of work with storytelling and metaphors, because any techniques I've used today are the ones that will work with your peers as well. And we need to keep at it because we're difficult as human beings. We're hard because of all the reasons mentioned earlier. We're struggling to receive information, but we've got a great opportunity to package it up better and simpler for people.
Oh, Karen, that takes us to the end of all of the questions. I just wanted to go through, and the last part really still resonates with me, small and simple. The steps need to be small and simple, and start with a single message. Find your true north. Look for that North Star and find out who else is moving with you. What is the compelling message, and find the alignment and the momentum with that compelling message. Include everyone in the leadership of that message. Teach belief. Teach people to believe in it. Invest in those people and empower their growth, and strive for continuous improvement. Karen, Leader Like Limited, thank you so very much for your time and sharing your insight with us today. I'll see you in London.
Thank you, Crystal, for the fantastic summary. I couldn't have done it better myself. Thank you. And thanks everyone for attending and listening.